Is what we believe about the last days actually true? If you grew up in the Western church like I did, you've probably heard of the view of the end times that there's this Antichrist figure coming. He'll bring this great tribulation on all the Christians. Jesus will come back with a sword coming out of his mouth, riding on a Pegasus, and kill almost half the world's population, then destroy the whole world with fire and create a strange moral utopia with no Starbucks, tacos, pizza, or iPhones. I used to think this was the only view there was, and so I thought it had to be the right one because everybody believed it. But there's actually 4 popular views of what the last days in the Bible are. The first view is called Futurism. This is the view I just mentioned, that everything's going to happen in the future, and this is probably the most predominant view in the Western world, but not across the whole world. The second view is called Historicism. This is the view that the events of the last days started happening back in the 1st century and they've been playing out throughout all of history. The third view is called Idealism, which is the view that the book of Revelation isn't talking about prophecies going to happen in the future, but are allegories or symbols of what goes on in the supernatural realm between God, Satan, and the believer, much like the story of Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. The fourth view is called Preterism, or fulfilled eschatology. Preterism is the view that the last day scriptures were actually fulfilled back in the 1st century. This is what I now believe. Now you might be thinking, how could you believe that? This hasn't happened yet, that hasn't happened yet, we haven't seen this, that, or this, and that's completely understandable. However, let me share 2 reasons why I've chosen to believe this view and have rejected the other 3 views. The first reason is audience relevance. See, the Bible was written for us, but it wasn't written directly to us. It was written to people almost 2,000 or more years ago in a very different culture with very different ways of using language sometimes. Ancient Hebrew prophetic language is chock full of metaphors and symbols, and if we want to be sure we're interpreting these prophecies correctly, we need to consider audience relevance, which simply means to consider how the original audience, hearing or reading the words in the scriptures, would have understood them, especially with the bizarre sounding terms and concepts like heaven and earth burning up, the sun, moon, and stars going dark, Jesus riding on the clouds with a sword coming out of his mouth. And almost all scholars and theologians agree the easiest and most effective way to know how the original readers would have understood the scriptures is by comparing scripture with scripture. So we find these terms and concepts in other parts of scripture, see how they're used there in the same type of context, and let that shed light on what they mean in the New Testament prophecies. This is what preterists do with the last days prophecies. We interpret these words, terms, and concepts we find in last days prophecies according to how they are used in prophecy throughout the Bible. The other views interpret these 2,000-year-old last days prophecies through a 21st century Western mindset and don't consider how the original audience would have understood them. Now, the second reason I like preterism is because of all the time statements in the Bible. The New Testament is jam-packed with statements that say the last days events were going to happen in the lifetime of those alive back in the 1st century. Revelation 1:1 and 22:6 says the last days events would be soon. Revelation 2:16, 3:11, 11:14, 22:7, 22:12, and 22:20 says the events would happen shortly. Romans 13:11 through 12, Philippians 4:5, Hebrews 10:25, James 5:8, 1 Peter 4:7, Revelation 1:3 and 22:10 says the time was near. And Acts 17:31, 24:15 and 25, 26:22, Romans 8:18, Ephesians 1:21, 2 Timothy 4:1, 1 Peter 5:1, and Revelation 1:19 and 17:8 says the events were about to take place. Matthew 24:34 says that generation back then would not pass away until all the last days events took place. Preterism pays attention to all these time statements and honors them. However, when someone doesn't interpret scripture with scripture or consider how the original audience would have understood the prophetic scriptures, they misinterpret what the last days prophecies are saying. Then because the last days events haven't happened according to how they've misunderstood the scriptures to say they would happen, they have to ignore or dismiss all these time statements that say these events would happen in the 1st century. And if that's you, don't feel bad because I was once right there too. People saying 1,000 years is like a day is one of the most lame butt excuses I've heard in my life. 1,000 years is like a day is Peter quoting from Psalms chapter 90 verses 2 through 4, which is speaking of God being ageless. It is not speaking about how God measures time. Throughout the scripture, God always communicated to people when things would happen according to how people measured time. Do you really think God suddenly changed his ways in the New Testament and decided to be confusing? And if the apostles believed that God measured time differently and no one knew when the last days events would happen, why would they repeatedly say that the last days events were soon, near, and were shortly or about to take place? And let's face it, if we say none of these things have happened yet and the time statements mean nothing, it makes the word of Jesus and the apostles untrustworthy. trustworthy. But if we consider how the original audience understood prophetic language in the Bible and interpret scripture with scripture, we can see a very clear way of how the last days events did in fact happen in the first century. And guess what? Then we can say that Jesus and the apostles weren't liars and they meant exactly what they said. To find out exactly what preterism is, click on the link in the description to get a copy of my latest book called How the End Times Ended in AD 70. It's only $2.99 for Kindle on Amazon right now. And feel free to check out my Facebook page to find videos and other resources on preterism. Thanks for watching, guys. God bless.